Welcome to In Her Voice, a podcast created for women who listen to and live by their deepest wisdom, their inner voice. This was made for you, the woman who feels pulled to more, to lead, to create, to dream, and to be a world changer. My name is Kelly Covert, and I am an inner voice coach. Join me here each week as we explore what it means to reach for your inspired potential, all while honoring your worthiness each and every day. Hello, you guys. This is Kelly Covert, and you are listening to In Her Voice, and I am so excited to bring back one of my popular guests, Andrea Own, although all of them are popular, to tell you the truth, because they're all amazing. But Andrea Own is back on the podcast to talk about values and happiness. And I think this is such an interesting conversation to really dig into and think about, because when our actions are not aligned with our values, chances are we're not going to feel happy. So if you are into being happy, and I hope you are, then this is a conversation that you do not want to miss. So let me just share a little bit about Andrea. Life coach, author, hellraiser, Andrea Own is passionate about empowering women to value themselves and fiercely love who they are. She helps high-achieving women let go of perfectionism, control, and isolation and choose courage and confidence instead. And she has written a really fun book called How to Not Feel Like Shit. And we talked about that on our last podcast interview, and you can find the link to that in the show notes. So I encourage you to check out that if you didn't hear it, because that is also a super fun interview. So let's get right to this conversation on values and happiness with Andrea Own. Well, hello there, Andrea Own. Welcome back to In Her Voice.
I'm so happy to be here, Kelly. Thanks for having me.
Me too. I like to think of my return guests as repeat offenders, only
Yes.
in the most loving way.
Well, I'm honored. I mean, I must have done something right the first time to be asked to come on again. Thank you.
100%. So for those of you who don't know Andrea or haven't listened to her podcast from before, I'll put a link to that. But we talked about your book, which was, I have the title right, How to Stop Feeling Like Shit.
That was the one we were talking about last year, yeah.
Yeah. And so we're going to do a fun little deep dive today into happiness.
Yeah.
Which is different, I think, than not feeling like shit.
The opposite, pretty much. Yeah.
But I think that where I want to start is in an interesting spot. What does happiness mean to you?
Oh my gosh, that's a loaded question. I think that it's really, it can look different for everyone. But if anyone has studied positive psychology, have you read the book, The How of Happiness?
I have not, but I need to, right?
Sonia,
it sounds good.
And I cannot pronounce her last name. It's something with an L, and I should know how to pronounce her last name because it's a book that I recommend a lot. But I think she's a TED Talk as well. But her and her colleagues did some research, and I love science. But what they discovered is that people have a set point of their happiness level, and people are born with this. And I want to say that makes up like 50% of how happy we are. And then your circumstances and how much effort you put into it is the rest of it. And I don't want to tell the stats because I'm going to get it wrong, but I think you get the gist of what I'm trying to say, that because I think we've all met those people who just really struggle, and we're not talking about depression. We're talking about just people's, they mostly focus on the negative, and they just have a really harder time focusing on positive and just being happy. And so all that being said, I think that how I think of happiness is really just where you are proactive in your life in focusing on the things that make you feel good and taking action towards that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. And I love that it's about action.
Yes.
Right? Like happiness is not something that you sit on the chair and wait to rain down on you.
Exactly. There are things that we can do that will help us along the path of happiness. And the reason I wanted to tell that story about about the science behind it, is because it, there are some people who it just comes more naturally than to others. And so I didn't want anybody to feel bad out there. It was like, but I really struggle with this. It could be part of your DNA, but that doesn't mean that you can't improve your happiness.
Well, and I think that's what I was going to ask you, that exact thing. Well, so if someone is on the low scale of happiness in their DNA, that doesn't mean that they have to be miserable for the rest of their lives.
No. It's just, I think, something where they can work on having compassion for themselves. And I don't really think that it's like, well, I can just opt out now. I can just opt out of trying to improve my life or anything like that. It just might be a little bit more of a struggle for them. And again, so my hope is that those people can learn to practice self-compassion.
100%. So when we're on this path of happiness, like you called it so beautifully, what are sort of the key points of our journey that we need to be focused on to live in a place where we are happier than we were born to be?
Well, I know that the last time I was on your show, we talked a lot about emotions, and I think that and I'm going to leave that there. People can go listen to that episode if they want to, but it was no accident that I dedicated an entire chapter of my second book to talking about values. And it's one of those things that when I was in coach training about 10 plus years ago, I had never done values work myself. I was in my mid-30s at that point, and I was just starting my personal development journey, really. And I was sort of blown away. I was like, oh, I mean, this always sounds good. And I think maybe a lot of your listeners had done this at their corporate job, the company's values, but that's not necessarily theirs. And so that's what I invite people to do, is to start there with your values.
So when you say values, what do you mean? Like, how we feel about how we're eating, or what do you mean by values?
It can, but in a more general sense, I like to ask people the question, what's important about the way you live your life? What is important to you, period? What are the attributes? What are the virtues that matter to you? Not of your family of origin, not of maybe your community, or maybe you grew up in a religious organization that had certain values. And I always tell people when they're doing this exercise too, these are not up for judgment or ridicule by anyone. You don't even have to tell anyone that you're doing this. In fact, I encourage it, because I don't want people to worry about what other people are going to think. But probably the easiest way to do it is to just Google it, values work or list of values. Be careful, because you might get really overwhelmed. But in my book, I highlight a few of the most common that I hear from people. And those are things like love, freedom, courage, adventure, giving back, authenticity, being of service, stability, safety. Those are just some of kind of, the top values, and integrity and honesty, to get people thinking about what is important to them.
So I find that interesting that you're talking about how we have to separate out the values of our family of origin, or the values of any religious organization that we were brought up in. And I'd like to talk more about that, because as someone who was brought up in a Christian home, very devout, I found that, and when I first started doing this work, I was about the same age as you, like in my early 30s. I found that to be extremely difficult, almost to the point where I felt myself questioning my faith. Like, if I say that this thing is more important than this thing, does that mean that I'm not a Christian anymore? Does it mean that I don't believe in God anymore? And I worked through that, and I do still believe in God. I do still call myself a Christian, and I know that my values are not the same values that my parents have.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear that you've worked through it. And as someone who's been through a spiritual transition herself, I can so relate to your story. And I mean, that dogma, whoo, that'll kick your butt.
Right? It
Oh my
goes deep.
God, what's going to happen to me on Judgment Day? Yeah, that's very real fear, I think, for many of us who grew up in devout Christian homes. And I don't want to minimize at all that experience for people. And I am not here to tell you, that your religion is wrong or bad or anything. Like whatever you believe, by all means, if it's in alignment with who you are as a human, then that is for you and that's important to you and that's all that matters. But to answer your question, I think that and from a very personal level, that is what brought me away from the specific church label that I had because I felt like the rules were so black and white. And that's how I remember coming to, the leader of my church when I was in probably sixth grade and being so excited to tell him something spiritual that, he was my spiritual mentor that I had discovered in myself. And I knew this in my bones. I knew it in my heart. And he told me that I was wrong. And that we, as this religious community didn't believe that. And I remember feeling so disappointed and that stayed with me my entire life. And really finally, as I really struggled to find a church myself when my children were born and wondering what my place was as an adult, as a mother at that point. Am I going to raise my children the exact same way I was raised and feeling like I had to? And I would go to churches and would cry because I felt like I was at home, but at the same time, something didn't feel right. And what I came out of that realizing was that what I craved and what I really wanted and missed was the community. What didn't feel like home to me anymore was the doctrine. And so for me, I walked away from that and have a different belief system. I still believe in God and that sort of notion and idea and theory, but it looks different than it did before. So that was like a 10-year process. That did not happen in a week. It was about a 10-year process. However, I say all that because maybe an example might be perhaps your religious organization had a very strong value around being of service. But maybe right now you're in a place where you have small children or something's going on where you just don't have, it's just not important to you right now. So your values are not set in stone forever and ever, amen. They might change over time depending on the season that you're in. So that's where I invite you to look at, that maybe that example that I gave, like maybe right now, that's just not something that you can focus on. Maybe later, maybe never. But I invite people to try not to be attached to what it means, to what that value means. Like, is it important to you? Yes. Okay, just go with it. It's just sort of a brainstorming exercise in the beginning.
Right. Well, I think, when we think of values, it's kind of a loaded topic because there's so much tied into this idea of goodness and who you are and your moral center, right? And so, I think when I think about my own values, part of me, the ego part, is very tempted to put down all of these things that sound really good, that look really good on paper, but don't really feel authentic to me. So how can we get to the point, when we're working through this and maybe we're journaling on it, maybe we're just thinking about it or meditating about it, how can we get to that place of being honest with ourselves about who we are?
Well, I think what you mentioned before is really helpful. So, and you might want to, what I recommend is kind of printing out a list of values. You can find them online. There's tons of websites out there that'll give you a large list of values. And you can print it out and then go through and just circle any that jump out at you. And my guess is that first round that you go through all of those words, you're going to circle the ones as you just described, Kelly, like the ones that you think look good on paper or that you want to be your values, but you really, at the end of the day, they're not that important to you right now. And then also don't be afraid to circle values that you might not at all be honoring in your life, but that's something that I call those aspired values. So that might be something like physical health. And maybe you've taken smoking up again, and it's just not something that's going really great for you. Or maybe you want, fun and humor is one of yours, but you just have been working so hard that has not been a part of your life. So circle the aspired values as well, and then go back and ask yourself more specific questions like, what values do I need to honor to get me to the next level in my personal life? And be specific about that. That'll allow you to hone in on maybe your top 10.
That's really, really good advice. As I sit here, I'm trying to think of one of my values that is definitely a core value for me, but that I didn't understand how important it was for a really long time because I didn't want to acknowledge that I had that inside of me. And that is creativity. So for me, that is absolutely one of my values. And I understand now that in order to feel happy, in order to feel like I'm being who I'm meant to be on this
in order for you to feel alive,
right, that I need to be creating things. But the challenge was that for a long time, I thought being creative meant that I had to be an artist or that I had to be crafty or, that I had to do all these things that I didn't like doing. And that it was not until I realized that, I create things every single day when I sit down and record a podcast.
Yes.
I create things when I sit down and write an email or write a post on Instagram or, share something with my kids, a funny story. That's a creation. And that's honoring my need to be creative. And so I think sometimes too, we have to almost get out of who we think we are and just be 100% open to who we might be.
Yes. I actually wrote about that in my first book because that is such a misconception about creativity. And people think that that is reserved for people who make a living painting or sculpting or things like that. And everything else is just, it's not them. Those are for people over there. And I think you nailed it. Exactly what you were saying. Creativity can look like so many different things, like cooking a really amazing meal, creating a podcast episode, just writing in your journal, whatever it is. And also, you said something that was important that I wanted to make sure that I remembered. Yes. It was about, I love that you defined what creativity looks like for you. And that is my next step in this process is how I describe it in the book is, hang on, my phone is ringing. Okay, sorry about that. How I describe it in the book is that saying your values, like professing them and naming them, is like naming your children and calling that parenting. Like, no, that's not how it works. Like, you name your children and then you actually have to do the work to parent them. And it's a lifelong process, right? Well, it's the same with values. So you can tell people or the paper what your values are. It's creativity. Okay, the next step is I want to know, what does that look like for you, Kelly? I call it like on the ground level, like on a day in and day out basis. What does that look like? And what is the thing that you need to be doing when you know that you're honoring it? So like take the example of authenticity. So that might be sort of the obvious, what we think of when we think of authenticity is like being yourself, being your true self. But what it also might look like for people is knowing when you are chasing perfectionism or people pleasing, because that's not being authentic, or taking responsibility for your mistakes when you mess up and maybe have to make amends or apologize. It might look like for some people, cleaning up messes and apologizing, or also really just having hard conversations and setting boundaries. That's authenticity. So I don't want people to think like, that's it. I just know what they are. And then, run away like feeling great because you know what your values are. Well, what do they actually look like on a day-to-day basis?
Yes. And I think that is how you get to the happiness piece, right? So it's about knowing those values and then knowing what actions are required to live into the values. And then you are creating your happiness because you are feeling alive, because you are doing what you've been called to do. You're living how you've been called to live.
Yeah.
And I love that idea of the action piece. Like that's so, so essential.
And sometimes that action is hard.
Thank you. Thank you.
I don't want people to walk away from this conversation thinking like it's always rainbows and unicorns. I mean, I just on, was it Friday? I think it was like last week, had to have a really hard conversation with someone. And I will be honest with you, I did not want to do it. And I would have been cheating myself and not honoring my own value of courage by not having the conversation. I was chickening out. I knew it was going to be so uncomfortable. It was one of those situations where both outcomes sucked. To not have the conversation with this person meant I had to follow through with something that felt really bad. And having the conversation was going to be deeply uncomfortable. And I might not get what I want.
Right.
I
Yeah.
can't guarantee that when I asked for this thing that needed to request, the person was going to oblige. And so in those situations, we've all been in those tricky situations. I had to ask myself, like, which of those both uncomfortable paths is in honor of me and my values. And, it was having the hard conversation. And luckily, it turned out in my favor, and both of us walked away happy. And that's not always the case. And it just is like, I just wanted to underscore that it is not always, the path is not always smooth.
Well, and I so appreciate that, because I think that sometimes we get stuck in that. Like, oh, well, if it's hard, that means it's not what I'm supposed to do.
Right.
And that's not the case. And since we're talking about happiness, I think it's important to point out that happiness, I don't know about you, but at least for me, happiness doesn't always mean that like I'm jumping for joy.
Mm-hmm.
Happiness for me is more about feeling like who I'm supposed to feel like. Does that make sense?
Totally. Yes. Well, I mean, you were talking to like a self-help junkie. So.
Well, yeah. Right back
and I bet
at
all
ya.
your listeners, yes, same. There's a feeling of congruency. You feel more at home and more comfortable with who you are. And this, I believe, also breeds confidence. Like, this is where confidence comes from. Like, the more aligned you are with your values, the more brave and courageous you are being in your life, the more you can trust yourself on the other side. So what that means is the example that I just gave, that is how I create self-trust and trusting in just life in general. When I am on the right path, when I am honoring my values, that on the other side, I can trust myself that I will be okay on the other end. If that conversation had not gone well, I would have been deeply bummed about it, but I still would have felt great within myself that I, in the first place, had the conversation and showed up in a courageous way. So what that means is I wasn't confrontational or rude or demanding. I could still come to this conversation and say, hey, I am super grateful for our relationship. I mean, this is just communication 101. I'm super grateful for our relationship. I have this thing that has come up for me and I really need to talk to you about it. Here it is. And I value our relationship and that's why I'm coming to you with this. And what are my options?
Mm-hmm.
That is not something I learned when I was a kid. Not that I grew up in a rowdy home or anything like that, but it's just we typically don't learn those types of things. But I say all that because even if the outcome does not go your way, my hope is that you, the listener, is unattached to the outcome. So meaning, of course, you're going to want what you want, but if it does not go your way, you don't look at that as having anything to do with your worth or who you are as a person. And I hope that you can be proud of how you showed up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really love that. And I think it's important to point out too that you talk about this idea of congruency, and I love that word. And I think another word that is similar is like feeling aligned.
Yeah.
And when you're out, like when you're out of congruency, when you're out of alignment, you feel that. Like I call it friction. Like I feel that unease. I feel that friction. And I think sometimes we're so trying to avoid that feeling that we don't appreciate what it's telling us.
Yeah. We can
like
be people please.
Exactly. We just like, we like try to avoid it because we don't want to feel it. But when we feel that and we pay attention to it, then we can get clear about how that is not aligning with our values.
Yeah.
And I think that nobody is ever, I don't think anyway, in 100% alignment all of the time.
Oh no.
I mean, we're humans. Like, we have things that
Yes.
happen. I recently in my own life, I was privy to a pretty big secret. And for like a month and a half, and I was in contact with a lot of people who would really very much like to know this secret, but I was not at liberty to speak it. And in many ways, I felt like I was living a lie. Like,
Oh
it was
no. Yeah.
really, really hard on me because I, like, at times I would feel like physically sick, like,
Oh man.
oh, and I felt like I didn't have much of a choice in that particular circumstance. But what it showed me is it's really important for me to be transparent and honest with people. That is something that I need in my life in order to feel right and aligned and to not have that friction. So we can use those moments of our life when we fall out of alignment, or when things aren't going exactly the way we want, to kind of mine for data of like, okay, well, so what does this tell me that I need?
Yeah. And when the values work that I do with people, I ask them, part of the exercise is to ask yourself, what are the red flags that happen in your life that can guide you into knowing that you're out of alignment with your values? And so for me personally, it is, as someone who's been sober for 7+ years from alcohol, I know that it's gotten really bad if I think about drinking. If I have that thought of like, gosh, a glass of wine sounds really great right now. Like, that is a huge, that's like a red flag smacking me over the head that something needs to be looked at. Also, if I get passive aggressive with my husband, that is an immediate sign that something else is going on, typically between he and I, not always, but something is not being talked about. Something, I'm like not telling him something that I need support with, or that I'm feeling unappreciated and I need to tell him, I need to communicate with him, as our therapist taught us how to do. Uh, but like, I know now what are the signs, whether it's a body kind of feeling that I have, whether it's an action that I take that does not feel good. It might feel good in the moment to snap at my husband and be passive aggressive, but I know as soon as it comes out of my mouth, I'm like, oh, I have to have a conversation with him. So I invite people to look at what their red flags might be.
And I think as you become aware, like even in this conversation, as you're listening to us talk about these red flags, you may think, well, I have no idea what my red flags are. So now you are aware. You are aware that they're there, and you can kind of be on the lookout for them. And a lot of it is about looking back and saying, oh, that's what that meant.
Yeah.
That's how I felt when I was not aligned, or when I was not living according to this value. And then you can start to sort of pay attention to that. So when it hits you the next time, you're like, oh, here it is again. I remember this feeling. I remember this red flag. I need to make it right.
Yeah. And what that looks like for me, and I think it's helpful to give people examples of what it actually looks like in real life.
Yes, please.
Is I remember the last time that this happened, my husband was in the kitchen. Our laundry room is right off of the kitchen, and I'm in the laundry room folding clothes, and we're talking, and he said something to me. I don't even remember what it was, but I replied passive aggressively, and maybe there was like some snarkiness and sarcasm in there. And as soon as I said it, and the conversation continued, and as soon as I said it, and it's funny, he's gotten better about calling out my passive aggressiveness because I do it to him too. Like, we'll just say it, like, are you being passive aggressive? And it's like, ugh. But I immediately knew. And within 5 minutes, I walked into the kitchen and I took a big deep breath. I probably put my hands on my hips and I said, I was passive aggressive and it didn't have anything to do with what we were talking about. And here's what it is. Because sometimes it takes me a few minutes to figure out, what am I really upset about? Yeah. What am I really irritated with? And that's usually for me what it is. What it was, I remember what I was irritated with is the summer is really difficult for me. And I work from home and my kids are at that elementary school age where they don't really need a babysitter anymore, especially if I'm home. But, you
can't really get much done.
Exactly. And it's difficult and we haven't figured out. And I just was feeling unappreciated. And You know, I think I said something like, how would you like it if I dropped them off every day at your work? Just not helpful. And so I needed to have a grown up conversation and be vulnerable too and say, hey, this is really difficult for me. And I don't know what the answer is. Can we figure it out together? And I need your
Mm-hmm.
support.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think in a lot of partnerships, not a lot, I shouldn't say that, but in some partnerships, one partner doesn't feel that supported by the other person, or are afraid to even have the conversation because the other person won't. I know I'm kind of getting off on a side tangent there, but I think it's important for people to hear what might actually be going on so that they can try to remedy it.
Yeah, and if you're in a relationship, and this could be a spouse to spouse relationship, this could be a work relationship,
Mm-hmm.
but if you're in any, long-term relationship, it's important to be able to trust that person and to be able to ask for support if you need it. So the fact that you and your husband can support each other and
Mm-hmm.
kind of pointing this out in a loving way, I think is so something to aspire to,
Yeah.
really. Like, we all need that.
Yeah, and we didn't start that way. You know, it came from a lot of friction and going around and around about the same topics, which I know is super common in partnerships, and then going to marriage counseling. And it wasn't. I've learned that you don't go to marriage counseling when your marriage is like on fire. Go when it's just starting to smolder.
Right. Don't wait till
so
it's too
you
late.
so you can get the tools so you can show up better for yourself and for your partner.
Yeah, 100%. Well, so now, how long does it take you to get back to your path of happiness, do you think, when you fall off?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And it depends on the topic, but in general, it's a matter of minutes. And I
Mhm.
will say this though, there are some days as someone who struggles with generalized anxiety disorder and sensory processing disorder, I have days where there's no rhyme or reason, where I just wake up with it. And thankfully, these are more few and far between in this season of my life. And so they don't happen all that often anymore. But when those happen, if I can go back to bed, honest to goodness, I will just go back to bed where I just kind of like throw my hands up and I'm like, my body is just doing whatever it needs to do.
Yeah.
Anxiety, I just surrender to today. And I do have other tools for that. But generally speaking, when I have moments of, like inner critic craziness or being incongruent with my husband or if I'm feeling like I need to kind of show my worth by whatever overachieving or trying to impress someone, like when I have those moments where I'm doing those things that are out of alignment with who I really want to be, I notice it probably within a handful of minutes. And the solution for me looks like self-compassion, because you can also beat yourself up for that. I call it the
Hmm.
ultimate ass kicker. You know, when you beat yourself up for realizing the things that you're doing that are out of alignment.
Yeah,
Oh
like
man.
let's beat a girl while she's down,
Right. That is never
essentially.
helpful, but common. So I have compassion for myself. I have a mantra where I just say, okay, well, that just happened. And then I make a decision about what needs to be done. Sometimes it
Mm.
can't happen immediately, if I need to make a phone call or talk to someone. And but for the most part, it's pretty fast. And I want to point out too, I have been practicing this for about 12 years. That did not happen at first. I spent 3+ decades figuring out how to do it the way that didn't feel good. And now, it's been a little over a decade of doing it differently.
Yeah. I mean, and that's what practice is all about,
Yeah.
right? It's about doing it over and over and over again until it becomes easier. And guess what? You still have to practice that.
Yeah,
The
exactly.
practice becomes part of living, and I really love that word, and I'm glad that you said that.
Yeah. It's so much awareness. And I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but it really is about being aware of it so that you can choose things that are more in alignment with who you want to be.
Yeah. And, that's why I encourage you guys to do practices like journal and meditate and really be intentional about listening to your inner voice, about understanding who you are, discovering who you are and knowing yourself deeply, like understanding what your values are and understanding what actions beget those values. That is such important work, the most important work, if you ask me.
I agree with you 1,000%. Yes, woman.
Yes. So Andrea, let's hear it. What has your inner voice been saying to you lately?
My inner voice has been saying to me that I need to have more fun. I don't think it's any coincidence that I mentioned the value around humor and fun.
Uh-huh.
It's I've experienced some burnout last year, and it was also a year of healing for me. So I think that that attributes to it as well. But I've moved away from that. And in the very start of this career, I had a lot more fun and a lot more silliness and ridiculousness, as I like to call it. And I moved away from that to try to be more quote unquote professional. And because a two-time author doesn't do that. And so
Ah, yeah.
my vow is to myself and to my intuition is to bring more of that back.
Love it. Love it. Well, so what are some of your action steps? I just want to know because I think that I tend to be not very fun. And so I'm like, yeah, I want to have more fun.
It's what it looks like for me is, oh, God, there's such a story behind this, but I'll try to make it quick. For me, it looks like make just things that I do on a regular basis and having my community and my audience be privy to that. So, for instance, and one of my highlights on my Instagram stories is called Dance Fever. And because I am always dancing in my kitchen, I even have a sign that I got that says, "This kitchen is for dancing." And my mother did it. I don't know if it's like a legacy that I'm carrying on. But some of my best childhood memories are my mom dancing, actually both of my parents dancing together in the kitchen. But I do it all the time. My family has just learned to like move around me as I joke that like I'm trying to get them to form a family band with me. So far there are no takers. But just,
Nobody's in.
turning on the camera when that happens and I'm not, sometimes I'm in my pajamas, I'm in my workout wear, I am singing into a spatula. It just is my everyday life. So that's
Mm-hmm.
one of the action steps.
Love it. Love it. Well, the next time I feel the urge to dance in the kitchen, which to be honest, never comes on me that too often, I'll tag you. I'll tag
Tag
you
me. Well, you
in.
have to
Yeah.
the first step is to put on music that you love. So do that
Mm-hmm.
and then see what happens.
Okay. All right. I actually, you know what? I do dance a lot at the gym, and that's because when a good song comes on, I can't help it.
Right? Every once in a while I'm at the grocery store and that happens and I can't
Oh,
not dance.
my grocery store plays the best music. I go to Wegmans, and so for those of you who live in the Northeast, you know and love Wegmans, but they play the best music, and it's like sing along music,
Yeah.
And I will just be like singing the song, and I'll see somebody else singing it,
Yes. Like
which
high five.
totally makes my day. I was like,
Yeah.
it's the best music.
I bet they
So
do that to keep people in the store to buy more stuff. There has to be some kind of study about that.
100%,
Hmm.
100%. I have no doubt, no doubt. But that's okay because I would live at Wegmans if I could. That's how much I love
That's
it.
awesome.
So you can love a grocery store. Well, Andrea, thank you so much for coming on today. I always love you. And you know what? This was super fun.
Oh,
So
good. I'm
you're rocking
glad.
out that value of fun and humor. And I really hope this helps everyone on their own path to happiness. Here's what I love about this. It is simple, it is straightforward, and every single one of us can do this. Every single one of us can take the time to understand our values and to live by them. And when we do that, essentially, that is another way of listening to our inner voice. And I just want to encourage all of you to take the time to jot down your values, to kind of see if your actions are aligning with what you say is important to you. And if you're not sure, or if you're struggling, or if you're just like, I want to be able to have this practice, I want to be able to put things into place so my actions can be aligned with my inner voice, so my actions can be aligned with my values, but I just am struggling. I just feel like I can't do it on my own, or I try and then I fall off again. If this is how you feel, don't feel like you have to do this alone. I would love to come on board with you, to support you, to hold you accountable, and to help you listen to your inner voice. Because when you begin doing that, everything changes. And I think that sometimes we feel like we should be able to do that on our own. Like, I'm a smart woman. I should be able to do that on my own. Why would I need to hire someone to help me do that? But the reality is sometimes you need that external support. And that is what I do. And the bonus of working with me in that respect is I also flow in my own intuitive gifts. So you get the added benefit of my intuition coupled with your intuition. What a powerful combination that is when women show up together listening to their inner voice. Whew. So if you're ready, if you're like, enough is enough, I'm going to ask for the help that I need because I want to live by this true voice, by my voice of wisdom. Let's talk. Sign up for a discovery call at kellycovert.com/discovery. It's 20 minutes. It's free. There's no commitment by signing up. But if you're interested to know how it works, how much it costs, what it feels like, what it looks like, let's talk. kellycovert.com/discovery. I cannot wait to connect with you. Remember, we need you showing up in this world, doing work that is aligned with your values and with your soul's true purpose. You are worthy.